The moment an avoidant individual genuinely recognizes that the other person has stopped trying, stopped reaching out, stopped holding space for the possibility of reconnection, a cascade of psychological responses activates that directly contradicts the avoidant person's conscious narrative about freedom and independence. The avoidant person has spent months or years creating distance, rejecting bids for connection, and reinforcing their need for separation, yet the actual realization that the other person has finally accepted this reality and moved genuinely away triggers a distinct three-stage panic response that reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of avoidant attachment. This panic is not intellectual but neurological, registering in the avoidant person's body and nervous system as a threat to the very foundation of their sense of self and security. Understanding these three stages illuminates what avoidants actually want beneath their distance and what they fear most when they lose it. Number 1. The first stage involves a sudden disorientation and the collapse of the avoidant person's internal narrative about the relationship. The avoidant person has constructed a story in which they chose distance, in which they set boundaries, in which they were protecting themselves from an unsuitable connection or an enmeshing partner. In this narrative, the avoidant person is the protagonist who made a choice and maintained control. When the other person actually accepts the distance and stops attempting connection, the avoidant person's narrative becomes untenable. The other person was not supposed to actually leave. The other person was supposed to continue making bids for connection that the avoidant person could continue rejecting. The dynamic was supposed to remain intact, with the avoidant person in the position of choosing distance and the other person in the position of accepting it. The collapse of this narrative creates disorientation. The avoidant person experiences a kind of confusion about who they are and what the relationship actually was. The avoidant person's internal story no longer makes sense. If the other person has truly given up, then the avoidant person was not setting boundaries but rather testing whether the other person would continue to care despite rejection. This disorientation is intensely uncomfortable because it forces the avoidant person to recognize their own agency in the loss. The avoidant person had assumed the other person would remain available indefinitely, allowing the avoidant person to maintain the illusion of control while keeping the connection secure. This assumption crumbles when the other person moves on. The avoidant person begins to realize, with dawning horror, that they were relying on the other person's persistence all along. The other person's unwillingness to give up was not a flaw in the other person but was actually what made the relationship feel safe to the avoidant person. The avoidant person could distance because they knew the other person would not let the connection die entirely. Number 2. The second stage of the first phase involves intense fear of replacement. The avoidant person becomes acutely aware that the other person is now available to form connections with other people. The other person, no longer waiting for the avoidant person, may develop new relationships or may simply cease to think about the avoidant person with the same frequency. This fear of replacement is not rational. The avoidant person chose the distance. The avoidant person enforced the boundaries. Yet the fear emerges anyway because the avoidant person's internal sense of security has always been contingent on the other person's continued availability. The other person's willingness to remain open to the possibility of reconnection even as the avoidant person maintained distance, provided a kind of psychological safety that the avoidant person did not consciously acknowledge. This fear of replacement is not rational. The avoidant person chose the distance. The avoidant person enforced the boundaries. Yet the fear emerges anyway because the avoidant person's internal sense of security has always been contingent on the other person's continued availability. The other person's willingness to remain open to the possibility of reconnection, even as the avoidant person maintained distance, provided a kind of psychological safety that the avoidant person did not consciously acknowledge. The fear manifests as intrusive thoughts about what the other person is doing, who they might be with, whether they are thinking about the avoidant person at all. The avoidant person, who typically deploys avoidance when uncomfortable, now finds that their usual coping mechanisms are ineffective because they cannot distance from the knowledge that the other person is truly gone. The avoidant person may begin attempting indirect contact to assess whether the other person is actually moving on or whether they are still available. The avoidant person may check the other person's social media, may reach out to mutual connections to gather information, or may find reasons to engineer accidental encounters. These behaviors contradict the avoidant person's explicit need for space, yet they emerge from a nervous system that senses the loss of something essential. The fear of replacement also extends to the avoidant person's concern that the other person will develop deep attachments to new people in ways they never did with the avoidant person. The other person may be more present, more available, more emotionally available to someone new. This thought is intolerable to the avoidant person because it suggests that the other person's unavailability was not about the other person's capacity, but about the avoidant person's unwillingness to receive what was being offered. Number 3. The third element of the first stage involves a shocking recognition of what the distance actually meant. When the avoidant person forced space and the other person accepted it without constant pursuit, the avoidant person could believe that the distance reflected the avoidant person's strength and independence. Now, with the other person genuinely gone, the avoidant person is confronted with the realization that the other person was actually accepting the avoidant person's rejection. This recognition is devastating because it reveals that the avoidant person's behavior was not appreciated or accepted, but rather tolerated, and now that tolerance has ended. The avoidant person is forced to confront that they were treating the other person in ways that the other person finally decided not to accept. The avoidant person can no longer frame their behavior as setting necessary boundaries, but must recognize it as causing harm. The avoidant person is forced to confront that they were treating the other person in ways that the other person finally decided not to accept. The avoidant person can no longer frame their behavior as setting necessary boundaries, but must recognize it as causing harm. The avoidant person may experience intense shame and regret in this stage, emotions they typically avoid at all costs. The avoidant person wants to disappear into themselves, to retreat completely, yet the pain of the loss is too acute to fully suppress. The avoidant person is caught between the impulse to distance and the emotional reality that distancing is what caused the loss. The recognition that the other person was actually accepting rejection rather than agreeing to the avoidant person's terms is humiliating. The other person's acceptance was not permission but was rather a resignation to the reality that the avoidant person could not show up emotionally. The other person tolerated what the avoidant person offered because the other person loved them, not because the other person agreed with the avoidant person's assertion that distance was what they needed. Number 4. The second stage of panic involves desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative and to re-establish connection on the avoidant person's terms. Having lost the ability to control through distance, the avoidant person now attempts to control through proximity or through reframing the relationship in ways that might allow the other person to reconsider. The avoidant person may initiate contact with explanations or with attempts to minimize the damage done. The avoidant person may present a version of themselves that is more available or more vulnerable than they have been previously. The avoidant person may suggest that circumstances have changed or that they are now ready for the connection they previously rejected. The second stage of panic involves desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative and to re-establish connection on the avoidant person's terms. Having lost the ability to control through distance, the avoidant person now attempts to control through proximity or through reframing the relationship in ways that might allow the other person to reconsider. The avoidant person may initiate contact with explanations or with attempts to minimize the damage done. The avoidant person may present a version of themselves that is more available or more vulnerable than they have been previously. The avoidant person may suggest that circumstances have changed or that they are now ready for the connection they previously rejected. These attempts are often contradicted by the avoidant person's actual behavior. The avoidant person may reach out and then quickly withdraw again. The avoidant person may make promises about change but then revert to avoidance when actual vulnerability or consistency is required. The avoidant person is desperately trying to regain control without actually making the internal changes that would support genuine presence. The desperation underlying these attempts reveals the depth of the avoidant person's panic. The controlled, independent persona that the avoidant person has maintained is cracking. The avoidant person's actions become less calculated and more reactive. The avoidant person is attempting to manage a crisis rather than to maintain a carefully constructed image. The avoidant person may also attempt to convince themselves and the other person that the separation was temporary, just a phase or a test of the other person's commitment. The avoidant person wants desperately to rewind time and to restart the relationship with the understanding they now possess about what mattered. Number 5. The third major element of the second stage involves attempts to understand what changed and why the other person actually let go when everyone else seemed willing to tolerate the avoidant person's patterns indefinitely. The avoidant person begins to recognize that the other person may have possessed qualities that made their departure particularly threatening. The avoidant person may recognize that the other person may have possessed qualities that made their departure particularly threatening. The avoidant person begins to understand that the other person was more secure, more self-sufficient, or more genuine than people the avoidant person has typically attracted. The other person did not need the avoidant person to complete them or to validate their worth. This independence, which once felt like freedom for the avoidant person, now feels like a threat because it meant the other person could actually leave without falling apart. The avoidant person may begin to understand that the other person's departure signals something different than other relationships in which partners eventually accepted the avoidant person's limitations. The other person refused to accept limitation. The other person refused to wait indefinitely for someone who was not fully present. This refusal, now recognized in retrospect, seems both admirable and devastating. The avoidant person may also recognize that the other person's departure was not angry or reactive but calm and final. The other person simply accepted that the avoidant person was not available and moved on to build a life with people who were. This calm acceptance is more psychologically destabilizing than anger would have been because it removes the possibility of dramatic reconciliation. The avoidant person now understands that the other person's stability was not a sign of lack of feeling, but rather was a sign of genuine security and self-worth. The other person could afford to let go because the other person's identity did not depend on the avoidant person's reciprocation. Number 6. The third major stage of panic involves a fundamental threat to the avoidant person's sense of self and their core belief that they are fundamentally unlovable or that love is dangerous. The avoidant person has used their distance as evidence of strength as a way to maintain autonomy and self-protection. Yet the other person's genuine departure forces a confrontation with the reality that the avoidant person's behavior actually caused harm and drove away someone who genuinely cared. This stage is characterized by existential crisis. The avoidant person begins to question the fundamental narrative they have constructed about themselves and about relationships. The avoidant person may experience depression, meaninglessness, or a pervasive sense that something essential has been lost and cannot be recovered. The avoidant person recognizes, often for the first time, that their defense mechanisms have not protected them, but have instead isolated them from the very thing their nervous system actually needs. The avoidant person maintained distance to avoid hurt, yet the distance itself created the greatest hurt of all. The irony is so profound that the avoidant person may struggle to process it. In this stage, the avoidant person is not trying to regain control or to restart the relationship. Instead, the avoidant person is grappling with fundamental questions about whether they are capable of genuine connection and whether they will ever be able to maintain a relationship with someone they genuinely care about. Number 7. A crucial element of the third stage involves the avoidant person's delayed grief response. The avoidant person may have felt relief initially when the other person finally accepted the distance and stopped making bids for connection. The avoidant person believed they had won, that they had successfully established the independence they claimed to want. Now, weeks or months later, the relief has been replaced by grief that cannot be suppressed or avoided. The avoidant person is forced to feel the loss in its full magnitude. The absence of the other person becomes palpable in ways the avoidant person cannot work around. The avoidant person's usual coping mechanisms of distraction and avoidance become insufficient to manage the emotional reality. The grief is complicated by the fact that the avoidant person is grieving someone who is not dead but simply unavailable. The avoidant person knows the other person is alive and potentially happy. The avoidant person may even see evidence of the other person's well-being through social media or through mutual connections. This knowledge makes the grief particularly painful because it highlights the avoidant person's role in creating the loss. The avoidant person in this stage is often isolated in their grief. The avoidant person cannot reach out to the other person because they have already created too much distance. The avoidant person cannot explain their grief to others without revealing the role their own behavior played in the loss. The avoidant person must grieve privately and largely silently. Number 8. A critical realization emerges in the third stage that the other person was not the problem. The avoidant person may have believed that the other person was too needy, too demanding, or too unwilling to respect boundaries. Now the avoidant person recognizes that the other person's requests were reasonable and that the avoidant person's response was disproportionate. The avoidant person begins to see patterns in which the other person was actually quite respectful of the avoidant person's needs for space and independence. The other person did not pressure or manipulate. The other person simply made themselves available and waited, which the avoidant person interpreted as neediness but which was actually patience. This recognition can trigger intense shame. The avoidant person realizes they may have characterized someone who genuinely loved them as flawed or demanding, when in reality the other person was attempting to love the avoidant person, while the avoidant person rejected them. The avoidant person must now confront the possibility that their rejection was not necessary, but was instead a failure of courage and emotional capacity. The avoidant person may also recognize that they will likely never find another person quite like the one who left. The qualities that made the other person special were not external markers but internal characteristics that cannot be easily duplicated. The person was secure enough not to need the avoidant person to feel complete. The person was patient enough to accept the avoidant person's limitations. The person was genuine enough to be worth the risk of intimacy. Number 9. An important aspect of the third stage involves the recognition that the panic is permanent rather than temporary. The avoidant person initially believed that moving through these stages would lead to acceptance and eventually to indifference. Yet the avoidant person discovers that this particular loss does not resolve. Years may pass and the avoidant person may build new relationships or develop new chapters of their life. Yet the loss of this particular person remains present in the background. The other person has become a kind of phantom attachment, someone the avoidant person thinks about periodically for the rest of their life. The other person remains the measure against which other relationships are evaluated. The permanence of this loss is particularly destabilizing because the avoidant person's system was designed to move on, to find the next person, to reset and begin again. Yet something about this particular loss does not respond to the avoidant person's usual coping mechanisms. The avoidant person cannot simply forget and move forward. The loss has altered the fundamental structure of the avoidant person's internal world. The avoidant person is forced to accept that they will never truly resolve this situation. They will never have the chance to rewrite the ending. They will never know if reconnection might have been possible if they had behaved differently. The uncertainty is almost as painful as the loss itself. Number 10. The final element of the third stage involves a potential opening toward genuine change and growth. Though this opening is rarely taken, the avoidant person has been forced by the other person's actual departure to confront the reality of their patterns and limitations in ways that they could not confront while the other person remained theoretically available. The avoidant person has the opportunity to examine why they push away, why they fear closeness, and why they sabotage relationships that could have been meaningful. The avoidant person could potentially take responsibility for their behavior and could work toward genuine change that might allow them to show up differently in future relationships. Yet the avoidant person often does not take this opportunity. The pain is so acute that the avoidant person's primary instinct is to protect themselves from ever feeling this way again. The avoidant person may construct new defenses, may become more isolated, or may make commitments to never allowing someone to matter to them in this way again. The avoidant person might recognize intellectually that their distance is what caused the loss, yet the emotional pain of that recognition may not be sufficient to override the nervous system's drive to protect through avoidance. The avoidant person may be aware that change is necessary, and yet be incapable of implementing it. The paradox of avoidant panic. The paradox of this three-stage panic response is that it proves what the avoidant person's distance was designed to deny. The avoidant person claimed independence and freedom, yet the moment the other person accepted these claims and moved away, the avoidant person's panic revealed that the other person's presence was essential to the avoidant person's sense of security and worth. The avoidant person had constructed a narrative in which they did not need the other person, in which distance was a choice, in which independence was the goal. The loss of the other person demonstrates that this narrative was false. The avoidant person did need the other person, even if the avoidant person could not admit or act on this need while the other person was still present. The critical realization about boundaries. A critical realization emerges in the third stage that the other person was not the problem. The avoidant person may have believed that the other person was too needy, too demanding, or too unwilling to respect boundaries. Now the avoidant person recognizes that the other person's requests were reasonable and that the avoidant person's response was disproportionate. The avoidant person begins to see patterns in which the other person was actually quite respectful of the avoidant person's needs for space and independence. The other person did not pressure or manipulate. The other person simply made themselves available and waited. This recognition is crushing because it proves the other person was not flawed but was actually patient and loving. The other person's calm acceptance of the boundary that the avoidant person set now reads as love rather than as indifference or weakness. The other person honored what the avoidant person said they needed while hoping the avoidant person might eventually want connection. This dual commitment to honoring boundaries while remaining open is extraordinarily rare. The invisibility of avoidant panic. The 3 stages of panic typically occur completely outside the awareness of the other person. The other person has moved on and built a new life. The other person rarely knows the extent of the avoidant person's distress or the depth of the panic that is occurring in the background of the avoidant person's life. The avoidant person manages the panic privately, often behind a facade of continued distance or apparent indifference. The avoidant person may reach out inconsistently or may maintain the pretense that they do not actually care. The other person may never know that the avoidant person has experienced the full 3-stage panic response that their genuine departure triggered. This invisibility means that the avoidant person suffers in silence while the other person remains unaware. The other person has no opportunity to witness the avoidant person's realization that they made a mistake. The other person has no chance to see the avoidant person's genuine regret. The other person has already moved forward. The permanence of the impact. The recognition that the 3-stage panic response reveals something fundamental about the avoidant person is perhaps the most significant aspect of this experience. The avoidant person comes to understand, finally, that the other person was never the problem. The avoidant person, their nervous system, their defenses, and their capacity to show up emotionally were the actual obstacles. This understanding is difficult to integrate because it means accepting full responsibility for the loss. The avoidant person can no longer blame the other person for being too demanding or for not accepting the avoidant person's boundaries. The avoidant person must confront the possibility that they are fundamentally limited in their capacity for genuine, intimate connection. The impact of this loss shapes the avoidant person's future relationships and choices, often in ways that remain unconscious. The avoidant person may avoid forming deep connections to prevent ever experiencing this level of panic again. The avoidant person may test people earlier and more aggressively to ensure they leave before the avoidant person's heart is fully engaged. Conclusion. When an avoidant person realizes that someone has genuinely given up and moved on, 3 stages of panic set in that reveal the fundamental contradiction in avoidant attachment patterns. The first stage involves disorientation about the narrative the avoidant person constructed, fear of replacement, and the shocking recognition of what the avoidant person's distance actually meant. The second stage involves desperate attempts to regain control and to understand what changed. The third stage involves a fundamental threat to the avoidant person's sense of self and a delayed grief response that demonstrates the person was never the problem, but the avoidant person's own limitations were. The avoidant person recognizes that the other person was not demanding, but patient, not needy, but genuinely loving. The avoidant person recognizes that they will likely never find another person quite like the one they lost. The 3-stage panic response proves conclusively that the avoidant person's earlier claims of independence and freedom were defensive narratives masking a fundamental need for connection. The actual loss of the other person demonstrates that the other person's presence was essential to the avoidant person's psychological stability, even if the avoidant person could not acknowledge or act on this need while the other person remained available. The loss is permanent, the recognition is often too late, and the opportunity to change, though present, is rarely taken.